All right, guys, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about technology. And as I referenced in class last week, the chapter is old. There's a new edition of the textbook, which I haven't required you guys to buy because I don't like to make you spend that kind of money because these are expensive. But this chapter specifically, this might feel a little bit outdated. So I'll try and discuss a little bit of the updated stuff too, specifically around AI and privacy and security around data privacy and stuff. Which throughout this class, mostly we've talked about how to think like a counselor in terms of your therapeutic work, confidentiality, that kind of stuff. But more and more, we're having to think about data privacy in terms of how we do our practice and where we put our information. At the time of this recording, this is the day after our last class, and yesterday was that big AWS, like Amazon Web Service data problem, whatever that was. It wasn't a data problem, it was a network connectivity problem or something like that. But I think it just highlights the fragility of, after COVID, everybody said everything is HIPAA compliant all of a sudden because everything had to be HIPAA compliant. And there was a lot of concern before that, whether it was or wasn't, and people didn't know. So they just erred on the side of caution and didn't use those tools. And then COVID came and every company said, yeah, it's HIPAA compliant. Don't worry about it. Whether that's true or not is hard to tell. Maybe I'm being a little bit cynical here, but still, you kind of get the idea. I don't know that we really have a full appreciation for how dependent we are and how insecure our data can be. So that puts us in a really precarious spot too. So we'll talk, I don't know how much more we'll get into it, because I'm realizing that throughout this class, I spend quite a bit of time telling you guys about the risks and the dangers, and that's partly intentional because I want us to be prepared for it. But I spend less time giving you actual answers of what you can do about it and specifically how to deal with these things. It's kind of by design, because when you get out to your various different kinds of sites, people will have practices that they'll be comfortable with, or they'll have learned experiences they can share. The problem is when I hear about practices, I hear people doing different things and using different services. Excuse me. And even if I train you on them now, tell you which companies people are using to transfer files or to electronically sign things or to store their client data or schedule software, all those things, it'll be outdated by the time you actually get there anyway. So I'm kind of leaving that part up to you guys later to figure out with supervisors and that kind of thing. But anyway, let's get into it. Okay. I wish there was a better place to put this. But anyway, we're talking, what are we using on and offline? Okay, so there's all these different categories for this slide. And I think the next one, we're going to talk about all these different kinds of things that we're using in the counseling space for different various kinds of tasks. So for social media, we all know these names. Facebook, one of the things that's been happening a lot on Facebook is there's professional groups on Facebook and a lot of referrals get made. And one of the discussions I routinely see is even if you think you're being private, like looking for, looking for a therapist for a 16-year-old client who's working through divorce issues, even that I'm finding some people that are uncomfortable with that level of disclosure. And yet, to facilitate the work, you kind of need to disclose things. And that might even seem minimal. But if you live in a small town, somebody else coming on there saying, well, I know who you are as a therapist, and I have an idea of the kind of people that that are in my town. And so information even like that can be disclosing things that are too much. So there's all these questions of like how much privacy is enough and how much do we need to disclose to do our work? So these open questions, really. But those kind of things happen on Facebook. Facebook, it can be a pretty good, at least for right now, it can be an okay place for marketing yourself as a new therapist, making more connections to build more referrals, finding referrals for clients like other people around the community who have openings at any particular given time. So it's a good way to like share real-time information. X, I don't know what people do on X. I don't use it, formerly known as Twitter, but I don't know. Maybe you guys can find some reason people are on it. One thing I've seen is I haven't seen a lot of providers use it, but there are people who are sort of influencers and social media content creators who use that to talk about topical things in mental health. So I don't really know a good example of someone in the counseling world because I don't use it. But that's a place where more people are exploring how do you support and promote positive mental health awareness and also sort of recovery communities by using things like that. So I don't know, there's a conversation to be had there that our code really doesn't provide a lot of guidance on. In fact, last year, I think the ACA does, there's several different like ethics writing contests, but I think the ACA did one and a few of our students submitted to it, didn't win, but the conversation was around somebody who was, I think they were streaming live. And so they had a bunch of followers and they got into this weird situation, kind of like we talked about in class where the lady fell in love with her therapist or whatever it was. But it was something about like disclose something about a client they were seeing in private session. And that client was watching the stream and then kind of felt outed. And so it made this weird scenario. So like if you're doing exploratory things like that, having a presence on X, TikTok, Instagram, whatever your thing is, creates these new and weird scenarios that are we're navigating now. So I don't probably need to spend a whole ton of time talking about Instagram, BeReal, Pinterest, YouTube, TikTok, Discord, Twitch, but all of those are different. If you're a creator of recorded content, that's different than being a creator of stream content, which is different than just being a consumer of Facebook and Instagram content. You know what I mean? It was brought up at a recent conference that, remember last week when I showed you guys my Spotify so I could play that dumb song for you? I think it's a good song, but you can judge accordingly however you want to. But I mean, even some people were saying, could it potentially influence the therapeutic relationship if clients saw the kind of music I was listening to? When I was in high school and college, Jack Johnson was a big star, had lots of hit songs and stuff. And I had a friend a couple of years ago who was like, I friggin' hate Jack Johnson. I think he's the worst. I think his music's the dumbest music. And I was like, okay, cool it, Isaac. But if a client saw that and found out what some of those personal biases are, some of us would be totally fine with that and say, yeah, we like different stuff. So what? Others of us say that might project a certain political slant or a certain personality slant or something like that in a way that might make the client relationship a little bit tenuous or vulnerable at least. Some look at it as a teachable moment. Others look at it as an inappropriate breach of self-disclosure. So all of these kind of things are just complicating our world because there's less and less privacy and more opportunities online to find out information about us. So for what it's worth. Social news, Reddit, YouTube comments, blogs. If you're in that space commenting, those things can be found out online. If you're providing those spaces on your own channel or something, again, that's more you have to manage. So complicated, yes, I don't think we need to talk about it too much right now, but there are situations, if any of you are getting in those situations, it's, I would say it's kind of risky territory, but it's yet also not inappropriate and an opportunity to connect with younger people, especially younger people. Unless you're on Facebook, then it's old people too. Because my mom, I always thought it was funny. My mom used to, in the early days of Facebook, like the 2000s, my mom and my sister were like, you're on Facebook? Why are you on Facebook? It's ruining children's lives. It's making us dumber or whatever. And now I look at my mom and I can't tear her away from her phone. And I'm like, Mom, why are you on Facebook? Nah. Just make fun of her for it. So anyway, for what it's worth, bookmarking sites, personal managing of data, RSS feeds. This is kind of old news now. RSS feeds aren't as much of a thing, I don't think, anymore. So I'm just going to skip over that one. But in terms of your work, you likely, if you're in some sort of private practice, if you don't have an administrator or like an office assistant or something, and a specific software that you purchase, well, even if you do, I guess, I don't know, every place has a calendar to manage things. And if you work at a big agency or organization, usually they have this kind of stuff figured out. But there are for smaller providers, there are a lot of options of how to, what calendar do you use? Do you use Gmail? If you use regular Gmail, it's a lot more risky than paying for Gmail Workspace. If you're using Outlook, are you using their Outlook calendar? Are you paying Microsoft 365 for that kind of access and privacy and added security features? Do you have your own proprietary software, like hospitals often have their own thing? Or are you using one of sort of like the cheaper subscription services, which very often don't have quite as much privacy and security in mind, or are just less strong in that area? So calendars, to-do lists, OneNote, Evernote, Google Environment, Zoom, Teams, WebEx, all those video conferencing, Simple Practice is another big one. The way you use Excel sheets, like there's just so much stuff that we use to get ourselves organized. Some of us even are going back to pen and paper because it's like, I just don't want to have to deal with all the complexity and frankly, the risk. But that has a downside too, because it also makes it harder to function in our really tech-heavy lives and coordinate between our phones and our computers and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot to think about here, and a lot of places where we probably, this is again why I'm saying if you're thinking about private practice, give it some time and really get out there, get good at being a clinician, and then worry about these more administrative things. Some people do it and they navigate it just fine, but there is just more of a learning curve there for you. I will say, actually, before I move on, most of the concern here, most, not all, but most of it has to do with confidentiality. Like, how are you protecting the privacy of client data? That's most of it. So their relationships, like dual relationships, I'd say that's another significant chunk of the concern here in terms of how are you relating to other people. We did talk about that a couple of weeks ago. But the example I just shared with you about this streamer who had a client in session, but also was viewing a stream or something like that. Those kind of dual relationships can happen, even if you're like, well, it's public and I can't control who my viewers are. And you have to figure that out. You have to figure out how to navigate through that space and whether it's appropriate or not. And I don't really know the right answer there, but it definitely is something that we're going to figure out as we go. You know what I mean? And what's appropriate and what's not. Another thing to consider are sort of, I guess, other problem areas, not just for organizing practices and functioning in work, but these are tech-related challenges. So addictive gaming. I don't know what else there is to say about that. I've had conversations in other classes about concerns over addictive gaming. We're talking not just like video game players who play casually, but like phone users and console users and PC users and that kind of thing, of how much is too much and how much is even a little bit tearing at the social fabric that we have when we're just not going outside and seeing friends in person and meeting our neighbors and spending time just being in relationship with people. You know, this, it might slowly be degrading our ability to be comfortable with each other and increasing the anxiety, generally speaking. But that's a conversation to be had. Brainwashing, groupthink, those kind of things. There's been some good journalism done on YouTube communities and Reddit communities and things like that, and how they're changing the way people think and really challenging culturally, especially politically, how people think about the dangers out in our world and who the bad people are, and sort of almost like grooming people. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, but oftentimes it's like sort of politically motivated or culturally motivated. Think of like incel groups, involuntary celibates. Most people know what that means, but you know, it's started as a supportive community online for people who feel like cultural rejects and who don't have not had romantic experiences, and then it turned into almost like a hate group for, you know, to get back at the popular people and that kind of stuff, and sort of almost turned into a community of people who just built up that anger and then took it out on people in real life. So that's a thing. Managing anonymous behavior, things like cyberbullying. But even when we go online, this is one thing I've been seeing a lot lately. On Facebook groups, people are asking sensitive questions, but they're using the option to be anonymous in that group instead of using their real name, because there's lots of concern, and I would say fear and potentially anxiety, which on our part, of how is this going to be perceived by somebody else? And what are the people going to think of me if I ask this question? And I'm sure some of that stuff runs through your guys' minds when you're in class of like, I don't want to look like a dummy. I don't want to look like I'm taking too many risks. I don't want to be perceived as a certain kind of person. And that has potential to be contributing to our anxiety by not challenging that anxiety and saying, is this a real thing? Or do I need to be worried about people? Or is it actually safe to ask dumb questions? And frankly, people kind of respect that when you have the integrity to ask the hard questions out loud so they don't have to. You know what I mean? So there's a conversation to be had there about whether anonymous behavior allows for anonymity. I guess even in the counseling space, is confidentiality and privacy necessary for people to get into counseling? Yes. And do the work of counseling? Yes. But isn't it ideal to get people healthy enough so they can disclose some things, not everything, but some things about their personal life without feeling shame? Kind of. So it's this sort of double-edged sword with this anonymity thing. Exposure to unhealthy content, age appropriate, like sex and violence. I mean, I've been hearing about this since I was a kid. Actually, before I was a kid, like Elvis is ruining our children, rock and roll is killing our people. Oh, what about all our morals and values and all that kind of stuff? And I'm not really, I guess this is just for me personally, I'm not terribly convinced that, well, I shouldn't say that. There's something kind of silly about every single age thinking the next generation is getting worse. It seems like it's been a pervasive thing for a long time. And there's also something that's really good point about that, about the effect that more violence and more moral degrading behaviors and what's on TV and the news. And, you know, when I was a kid, you couldn't swear on TV or in movies. And now it seems like it's everywhere. And the amount of sexual material is sort of a lot more rampant than it used to be, I think anyway. So what is that doing to our children and it's not just like, you know, protecting the innocence of childhood. There's a little bit to that, but it's also like, how do kids developmentally integrate that into their life and then make decisions about what part of their world is private and they need to keep safe and what part can they just give away? I'm thinking of like the sexual content specifically. Excuse me. Hold on one sec. Okay, let me try again. Compulsive phone use, that's another one. Social isolation, more of that may be related to addictive gaming and, you know, brainwashing and all that kind of stuff too. But still, seems like it's part of the equation here. When it comes to online counseling, the research is still mixed about preferences. And even when I made this slide deck a few years ago, I think it's still true to this day that online therapy is definitely people have moved away from it. Both clients are less interested in doing it because they're seeing the value of in-person therapy, and counselors are moving away from telehealth. And yet there's still a ton of people that do it. The problem is we don't really know enough about its efficacy, whether it works just as well as in-person counseling or whether there's something we're losing. I think this kind of relates back to what I was talking about, sort of the, I don't know where I was talking about it, but sort of like the social fabric, the things that hold us together, our ability to be with people in person and what that does for us. I'm not going to go into a whole sort of scientific explanation, but one of the things that we're learning a lot more about is neurologically, we have mirror neurons that are activated more in person than they are on screen. And so it does seem like there's a little bit more evidence coming out now that people are losing something when they're just seeing online behavior or just having like online sessions. Even just watching me right now, there's our brain does not recognize the same way when there's just a visual online in sort of 2 dimensions. So I don't know, it's a conversation to be had. Nevertheless, there's still a lot more work to be done to understand whether online therapy is as effective as other delivery methods. Not theories, but delivery methods. That's a really new thing for us because it's been in person for so long. Social media distorts our perception of self and external reality. This goes back to that brainwashing groupthink. But if you're only consuming what your algorithm gives you, which is, I don't know, like, I forget the terms, but like the beauty stuff on TikTok, or if you're only watching video games or only content that's delivered to you from a certain political perspective, then it distorts what is real, even what news channels you listen to or watch or whatever. And the question of what else? There's a million more things probably that are problems that are worth talking about. Okay. Distance counseling. We'll talk a little bit more about that one. I mean, I guess this first bullet point and subpoint is sort of what we were talking about just now. Is building relationship online or in person the same? And everybody that I talk to, well, not everybody, I guess, it's kind of an overgeneralization, but so many people that I talk to say it's just different. There's just something else about it. Being in person is just different. And there's something lost when you go online. There are a few people who I've talked to who say, like, online counseling, it is different. And yet I'm not convinced that it's not just as good, just in a different way. And so there are proponents to doing online therapy and online education. And there probably are more people, I'd say maybe upwards of like 80% of the people that I talk to, which is a biased sample. It's not everybody, right? But especially here in Whitewater, because we are an in-person program. But more people think that there is something that's lost when you're doing online counseling. So for what it's worth, those are the opinions. What we don't really know is how our clients helped more or less by one method over the other, or the same. If you're doing distance counseling online, one of the things that we're supposed to be getting better at, and I think we are getting better at it, is preparing you guys to work in that online environment. If that's going to be a thing, especially post-COVID, we thought, oh, there's going to be a lot more people doing this. Now we're seeing that pendulum swing back, but it's still important to train you guys to understand how to do telehealth work. I've been talking to Krista and Jen and Gina and others, and Ola and Mastawal and anybody who wants to listen, really, about how we might want to be a little bit more intentional about putting this into our curriculum here, so that you guys have a more training in that. And we're still working on it. We do some training. I think you'll probably get some in your various classes, but I think there's more that we could probably do. But specifically, how do you then have the conversation about how to keep people safe? What do you do? Well, I'll read this list and I'll add some more. Distance counseling credentials. Do you need to be specially trained in that, or can we all just assume that we get it? We know how to navigate through Zoom and how to click the buttons and all that stuff. If we're competent enough in using the software, is that enough? Are there any risks and benefits of any tech use, including social media, in terms of how you're having an online presence? That changes the consent process. What to do if the tech fails? So if you're having a session with somebody and somebody's internet cuts out, do you continue on the phone? Do you have a different phone line? How do we facilitate this kind of work? Those are different considerations when you're doing online work too. If somebody's feeling safe, how do you find resources for them in their community versus yours, depending on where they're at? That's another question. Response time. I don't even really know what that means, to be honest. Changes in the consent process related to response time. I'm not sure what that one's about. I forgot why I put that one on there. So I'm going to skip over that one for now. And if I think of it, I'll let you guys know in class. Emergency procedures. This is the very thing that kept people from doing online counseling before COVID. Because what happens if somebody gets suicidal and I have to call for a welfare check? What happens if somebody is experiencing domestic violence and is living with their perpetrator, who's maybe listening off camera to their sessions, or that kind of stuff? So there's a lot to think about there, and I think we're kind of capturing it pretty well, but I'm not sure that we've mitigated the risks as much as some of us would like to. And I guess I'll say on that note too, it is probably will be largely up to your agencies and the people you work with. But if you're working in a private practice and you have a little more autonomy to make these decisions, it's up to you whether you want to see a client telehealth or not, and you get to make that judgment call. There are people. I haven't really had too much experience with working with people online specifically, but there are past clients I can think of who I'm like, you'd be a perfect candidate for doing telehealth work. Other people, not even close, not so much, right? I mean, I could give you examples in class maybe, but there are people who are just working through like I'm just struggling interpersonally between my spouse and we want to have a better relationship. And I'm like, yeah, we can do a lot of that work online. Most of that can happen. There are kids who are really familiar with being online so much, and they spend a lot of time online on like Discord chats and that kind of stuff. So like they are just so comfortable and familiar with the online environment. Doesn't mean it's necessarily good for them, but at least they're comfortable. So I've thought those people are good candidates for telehealth work too. Other people who are not good candidates are really young kids, people that are having a harder time with emotional regulation, and we're doing that regulatory work or co-regulation work in session. Those times I usually say, this is probably not the best kind of environment for them to be successful in. So, or people who are, I don't know, for older folks or people that are not as familiar with technology, spend too much time just struggling through, how do you click the button again? And so it's not even worth trying to fumble through it because we lose time doing the actual work. Time zones differences can be a thing, but that's usually not as big of a deal because most people are working within the state they're supposed to be working in. But that's not always true. So whether it's legal or not, I've heard of a lot of people who are, even though the counseling compact has not been enacted yet, it's still people are doing a lot of that work, even though they're not supposed to, I think. So something to be mindful of, that there are people not following the rules because they think that they don't need to or whatever. So a little more about distance counseling. The rules. What are those rules? Most of those rules come from individual states. However, for all those people that are working across state lines inappropriately, a lot of times it doesn't. I think this is the situation we're in. I don't even want to put a number to it exactly, but many times out of 10, we'll say, nothing happens, and clients are seen. Oh, I was just over at my mother's house 2 states away for the weekend, but can you still see me this one time? I'll be back next time. And like situations like that, where it's like, I trust the client, have a good sense of the risks involved, and it's probably not a big deal, right? It's illegal, but it doesn't seem like the law really fits those circumstances, or the rules, whatever. They don't fit those circumstances. So a lot of counselors are saying, I'm willing to accept or assume that risk in order to provide that service for my client. And this happened a lot during COVID when people are just moving, and a lot of counselors were saying, I'm just going to see the client because they're freaking out. So am I. And we need to see each other, whether it's the right reason or the wrong reason. These are emergency circumstances. Others were saying, nope, but we have to maintain a sense of normalcy and order. So we can't just decide to bend the rules just because we feel like it's important for us, So, where was I going with that? For those people that are assuming the risk, what that means is that even though 9 times out of 10 or many times out of 10, whatever, the risks, there may not be a problem, but that time that there is, the one time that there is, or the few times that there are, those will have potential to be litigated and will be dealt with in courts. And those are the kind of things like the Tarasoff decision and mandated reporting and duty to warn, all those things. It just takes one bad scenario to make something change and make more rules for the rest of us. And that doesn't mean that that's a bad thing, because we probably should be warning people if there's danger, right? And we probably should be helping people when they can't help themselves. And yet, you have to decide for yourself if you're going to take on that risk to do telehealth work in a way that's extra risky, So again, coming back to the idea that it's largely up to you whether you want to do that and how you want to do that and who your clients are and all those kind of considerations. I will tell you this, though, the location of counseling is where the client is. It used to be, and I think still is, the way it's written into the administrative rules or laws is that it's where the client is. It's supposed to be where the counselor is. It used to be that you saw people in person, and that was the only way. But some states have it written of like where the client is at. Some state where the client and counselor is at within the state borders. There's a little bit of difference, I think, in those, and that's really changing as we go. So I'm not exactly sure how to comment on that, of what it's like in all places. But okay, some more questions related to distance counseling. Are we lacking audio and visual cues or presence that we're trying to create for clients to help co-regulate, that kind of stuff? Is there a lack of security? We've talked about that. May not be able to tell when clients pose a threat to self or others. It's a good question. Are fees different, and should they be? Should people pay less or more for online counseling? I think you guys pay an extra technology fee for doing online classes. Should that be a thing? Are there additional costs that if you as a provider would have to accrue? And if so, can you pass that on to the client, or is that something that you need to take care of yourself? Is it your responsibility? These are the questions. I mean, if you in a capitalist democracy, you guys get to set your fee, and whatever people are willing to pay, technically you can ask for that. But it does pose some ethical questions, which is why it's relevant for this class of like, how much of that can we put off on our clients for, like, let's just say for sake of example, online counseling is not as effective and it also costs more. That creates an ethical question of whether we're doing right by our clients, right? Charging them more for less effective therapy. Time will tell. We don't know, but something to think about. Can the field protect from unqualified counselors online? Jurisdiction of state regulation. How do we know? How do we regulate? And how do we make sure that our people in Wisconsin, we'll just use us for example, if there's somebody down in Texas and they're advertising online, who sees that? Who knows that? Who regulates that? And they're saying, I will see you from Texas. And then how do we know that person has qualifications? Because they're not licensed in Wisconsin, right? Or even if they are, how do we manage that? That's a really hard sort of logistical question for us moving forward. And there'll be some interesting conversations on the licensing boards, I'll tell you that. Well, I'm guessing, I imagine there will be. Okay, let's talk about communication. Communicating with clients. Is it appropriate to text clients and students? We've had conversations about this a little bit. In fact, just this morning, I was texting with one of you guys, not in this class, but my internship class. I give out my text number. There are some students who I'm like, I would prefer that you not have this, right? So I navigate these things as well. Also, being a professor, the rules are slightly different because when I wear this hat, there's a different level of trust and communication that I'm okay with. Clients, there are some people who are completely fine with giving out their phone number to people. Some people use their personal phone number. Some people have a separate phone number for their work stuff. Some people keep the same device. I should say some people have two separate phones. Some people keep the same device, but then use like a Google number, which is a separate number, but then links to yours. And so there's services like that that can help kind of anonymize your phone number, but still use the same device. What's okay? How much confidentiality can we expect during that process? That's a good question. I don't really know the answer to that one. Are we sharing appointment information versus session content? In other words, if someone texts you and says, hey, I'm going to be late for my meeting today, is that appropriate to text over? Or somebody texts you in the evening and says, hey, I'm really struggling, I'm having a hard time. What do you do with that? And if you allow for appointment information, but then someone starts using it for the other thing, how comfortable are you having conversations about those boundaries of like, we can't do this over text, but we can tell me if you're going to be late. You know what I mean? So if you're comfortable having that conversation, is it okay to do that? Or would we just be better off avoiding all of it altogether? Those are good questions. How about email? Same situations with email. And I'm kind of looking at you school counselors, and this is Claire, if you're watching this and this is this class. But is it appropriate to use text with students in a K-12 school? How about email? Is that different? Is there a separate work email or a separate work phone? And like all those considerations make a difference probably. And that's where I'm like, you'll figure this out when you get to your sites. Like you'll get some guidance from other school counselors of how they do it on site there too. Phone counseling. I've never done phone counseling with anybody, but I've talked on the phone, right? And the question is that okay? I know people do it. And I know there's benefit to doing some of it, but the question is, are we losing too much in the process? communication about testing and assessment. And what I'm speaking of here specifically is, well, if you're facilitating testing or administering a test online, how are you ensuring that people aren't cheating on the test or disclosing private information to people in the background or who might be having access to their computer or something like that? There was another thing about that I wanted to mention, but there's a lot of ethical questions around online testing, and yet, especially during COVID, all those tests that weren't online went online because that was the only way to do it, and some of them have stayed online and continue to be. So lots and lots of questions, you guys. Advanced technology to consider further training. Okay, so if you are in the situation where you're like, okay, my head is already spinning from all the conversation we've been having for the last 35 minutes, how do I think about the more complicated technical stuff? If you're not very tech savvy, I'm going to talk about these things and you don't have to worry too much about them. If you are tech savvy and you're familiar with some of these terms, or even more familiar than I am, then consider yourself more informed and have something potential to offer other people who don't understand these things. In other words, there's a space out there for somebody who wants to sort of market themselves as an expert in counseling technology specifically, and how to consult with other people to help them set up their practices and that kind of thing to make sure they're solid, you know, sort of like IT adjacent almost, something like that. But VPNs, virtual private networks, these things used to be used a lot more. Now they're used less. But essentially what that does is sort of privatize your location so that somebody can't tell where you're calling from or where your IP address is located. Essentially what it does is two computers have to communicate, and they go through a service provider and they use your IP address, which is kind of like your home address or a phone number or something, uses that to communicate. But instead of going straight to that service provider, your connection goes from here to China to Germany and then back to, you know, Istanbul, Turkey, and then over to the ISP and then over to the clients. So it's really hard for anybody to really figure out where you are located. That's becoming less of the case. So less people are using VPNs, but it's still kind of good practice to do that. If you are, there are options to be more private. And I'm not going to go into this too deeply, but some of you maybe have heard in the news stuff about like an app called Signal. And Signal, well, let me use another one first. So if you're on Facebook, not private at all. If you're using WhatsApp, those messages are end-to-end encrypted, and end-to-end encrypted means that if somebody wants to interject in the middle, like a hacker wants to get into the middle, they can't find out what you're talking about because it's just jumbled letters. That's the encryption thing. If you use things like Signal, they're even more secure. And if you use things that are like, if you ever get into something like really crazy where you need like ultra privacy, like CIA privacy level or something, this thing called PGP is like, you have to send each other your key. It's not just like a phone number or an email address. It's like a phone number and email address with a very specific key that can only be used for your messaging back and forth. And so just like add these other layers of security. Most of you are not going to need to care about that, but just to get a sense of like how insecure we might be and some of the opportunities to be more so if we feel like we need to. Some clients will ask for things like this. I will say it's not very common, but occasionally you'll get somebody who's like ultra paranoid and be like, I won't even come to counseling if I think somebody else is going to get involved in this. And so you can say, well, actually, maybe we could use some more encrypted messaging. And I haven't had this a lot, so don't misunderstand that it's like a common thing. But those are opportunities. There are ways to do that if you want to learn about these things. How you store data is a consideration. So whether you store in the cloud, again, this whole Amazon thing last week with the, they have some server, one of those big giant data centers in North Carolina. That's what went down apparently. So if you're using, I use Dropbox a lot for my personal and work related data storage. If you're using that to keep client records, that's a question. Whether you keep them in a cloud storage system, which many people are, whether you're keeping them locally on a server in your office, or even just your local computer that isn't a server, there's a difference between the two. And then if you have a server connected with multiple computers in one office, that just changes the whole IT structure and where data is, and more entry points for problems, hackers, and computer failures and that kind of stuff. And then what do you do with paper? It used to be that people rented out like storage units or kept a separate office for all the file cabinets. People are moving away from that, and at our own risk, right? Another important thing is password management. This is how hackers and phishers and scammers all steal identities and steal data and money and all that kind of stuff. If you don't use a password manager, I highly recommend it. I use this one called LastPass, but there's a whole bunch of them. Here's some other names for them. Essentially what it does is it makes really, really complicated passwords that you don't even have to remember, and it auto-fills them into your computer. So I have a sheet at somewhere, I'm not going to tell you, that has hundreds of passwords for different accounts, everything from work to personal to whatever. But using a password manager means that I use different passwords for everything, and that software remembers all of it for everything. Again, if that thing goes down, I'm going to be in a right bit of trouble. But I also keep them backed up in my own private place, in my mattress. Just kidding, it's not my mattress. Just trying to fake you guys out. Okay, moving on. Deep fakes. This is almost old news now, because what used to be a big deal, deep fakes being made with these really powerful computers, is now at the fingertips of everybody. People making AI photo images and AI video images. And it's just like, it's become so common on social media that it's almost getting kind of annoying. I mean, it is kind of annoying, if you ask me, it's my opinion. But some of them are funny and some of them are just memey, kind of. But others are just totally inappropriate, and it's so easy to make them. So how that relates to the counseling process and practice, it's probably not something that you're going to see people like, showing up as another person. It could happen, but that's pretty unlikely, I think, at this point. But what might happen is you'll have clients who are dealing with somebody made some content about them, because I'm sure school kids are going to be saying, let me take all these pictures of this girl that I like and turn them into nudes. Or, I'll take this kid that I think is a complete dork and make a meme about him, a video of him, think of all the crazy things that could happen, right? So you'll have sort of that cyberbullying interact with people's mental health, and in ways that are content being created about them. I could see that being a thing. So I don't even like to think about that. For me personally, I'm like, I hope that doesn't happen, but I sort of suspect that's a potential of where this is going. Because kids are kids, they do lots of... You give kids access to power like that, and they use it sometimes for good, a lot of times for evil, just because kids are still working out how to relate to each other in kind and really appropriate ways. Some other random things to worry about. Here I go with more negativity and cynicism. So teaching online, I'm going to skip over that one because we haven't really talked about it a whole lot, but you guys can have your opinions. We can talk about them in class if you want to. If you have opinions about teaching online or learning online, is that in line with your same opinions about doing therapy online? Good question. Social media, we talked about this one, so I'm not going to go into it, but keeping personal and professional separation, knowing security controls. That used to be a thing where people were like, well, lock down your accounts and don't make sure your information's not private. And yes, that's still true. But I think now we've gotten to the point where even some social media companies are like trying to help us with that a little bit. They'll keep your data and they'll use it for all kinds of advertising stuff, but they won't promote it to the rest of the world. And there's still a lot to be learned about what to put out online. You know what I mean? If you guys use, this is a little different, but if you guys use, let's say you start your own practice and then someone Googles your name and all of a sudden they say, well, I didn't really like that therapist, so now I'm going to put a Google review up online. I don't know if you guys have been through Google reviews, but occasionally there's a person who responds to like a company that says, I'm sorry you had such a poor experience at our restaurant. please, if you could deal with this privately with us instead of posting information online and giving us a bad review, et cetera, right? So this is like a whole new thing that therapists may have to contend with. If you want to have an online presence to advertise, which is a reasonable thing to want and to do, frankly, but people are using it in ways that are not really set up for therapy practices, or maybe that's a good thing to hold us accountable. I don't know. But can you even respond to stuff like that? That's a yet to be determined, I guess. I've not seen people who are doing that and responding, but I have seen people leave Google reviews about therapists. Some of them glowing, some of them not so much. And then I'm not going to talk about this too much. There's probably a good conversation to be had, but I don't see it really happening a whole lot. But virtual therapy, people using like Oculus, or I think there's even like a VR Minecraft. I've heard people trying to explore that, like, MMO gaming and that kind of stuff, and doing therapy in that space. It's not really been too much of a thing for lots of technical reasons, but people are definitely interested in it. Second Life, Metaverse, doing therapy on Discord, that kind of stuff. So just things to consider. What do we got left? We got 2 more left. Okay. Diversity. Another consideration is accessibility. If we are moving online and using all these online tools in various different ways, from calendars to Zoom rooms, how accessible are they for all different kinds of people? And are we limiting opportunity for people that can't access stuff like that? So something worth thinking about. And it's not just people with disabilities. It's also, this was a big thing in Montana, where there were very rural spaces where people had connectivity problems. Just the internet infrastructure did not exist. The most promising thing at the time was things like Starlink satellites to give access to people in rural areas. But even still, when people live in places that don't have really strong connections, it just limits the ability to have a whole session when they're cutting out frequently. That would happen in classes where people were far away on a reservation and they were trying to connect to class, and their screen would get all jumbly and they couldn't hear. And then all of a sudden we couldn't hear them. And then it just became really problematic. So generational digital divides in terms of people understanding technology and the ability to be capable, competent, safe, responsible, ethical online, that kind of stuff. And then I kind of mentioned urban versus rural infrastructure already. And then AI. Here we go. I don't even know what to say about this one by now. The last couple of years when I wrote this, I said, where do we effing start? That's a good question, There are so many new things with AI that are changing our practice right now. Everything from chatbots, the people using them as therapists, to us using them to write therapy notes, which they just started at Crossroads in Janesville, where I'm starting to do some clinical hours and stuff. They started using a thing called Upheal, which does a lot of your therapy notes for you, and it does a ton of really powerful things. And the discussion around there seems to kind of be, there's a lot of really cool things that this does, and it really helps write things in a way that make us sound really smart, whether I know how to do the things it's telling me or not, like perform those kinds of therapy or not. And they're super helpful, and it's kind of scary. And I don't know if it's making us less capable, but regardless, if we sign off on a note and we've used AI to write it with us or for us, we're responsible for that. So how we ethically and responsibly use AI to help support our work without making it a crutch that we're leaning on, and also not allowing it to assume our voice for us, because we will be held responsible for anything we sign on. Something to consider. Chatbots are being explored all over the place, using them online, in children's toys, as operators of things like suicide lines. So lots of really strange and kind of scary sometimes. And yet there's all kinds of like, how do we triage somebody to help them get to the right provider or the right operator or something like that? If you've been on like a customer service call, you know the headache, but you also know probably you've been served pretty well by some of those chatbots to like get to the right place and get to the right phone number, someone who can actually help. And they're also frustrating. So AI, I think I mentioned, does diagnosis and treatment planning. That's DX is diagnosis, TX is treatment, and then transcription and note taking too. So lots more to talk about there, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to go there right now. So there's a fun quote for you there. There's another one over here. I'll let you read those. You can pause it if you want to, but thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see you in class. I'm finding out that most people watch this like right before we actually go to class. So I'll say this, I'll see you later. If you're watching it a few days before, then I'll see you when we get there. All right, bye-bye.